Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's look at the weekly news agenda. As usual, I'm joined by our senior fellow Rafe Heydel-Mankoo, a historian and role commentator, of course, and Amy Gallagher, the lady behind Stand Up to Woke, and also the SDP's candidate for the mayoralty, right? That's all correct. Formal now, is it? Yeah. Done and dusted? Great, well, all the very best with that. So before we talk about various issues of this week, a couple of very important ones, just one note for you about our upcoming locals event. Now that is this coming Tuesday, that is the 6th of February in the evening. As you know, our locals programme has been spreading throughout the UK. This one is in Wellingborough, and our guest speaker is Ben Habib. Very, very topical because, of course, we have a by-election happening in Wellingborough, and Ben Habib is the Reform candidate, so he's going to be the speaker there. He's a very good speaker too, Ben, so I do hope you can maybe come if you're in Wellingborough or in the surrounding area. If you'd like to, then please write to locals@newcultureforum.org.uk and we will send you the details of when and where. And it's free, of course. So that is on Tuesday, the 6th of February. I wanted to start by talking about this verdict that happened in the Laurence Fox case, Rafe. I'm being rather vague about it simply because it's actually quite a convoluted case, isn't it? But he lost in the High Court, didn't he?
Yes, it's an astonishing verdict. All the more astonishing because this is actually this is an appeal which he's lost in the High Court. And look, I've got a law degree, so I do understand the law, and I just cannot see why this is a just decision in this case. But to go back, Laurence Fox originally made a tweet about Sainsbury having a Black History Month, and he was questioning why it had that and saying, it's not. Should this be the case? He was branded a racist by two individuals for saying that, and to show how absurd it was to call him a racist, he perhaps unwisely responded by saying, you're a paedophile. His point was quite obviously the fact that you're obviously not a paedophile, like I'm obviously not a racist. And then one of these two people, a journalist, tweeted out a specific phrase saying any employer who employs Laurence Fox should know that he is unequivocally and without doubt a racist. He then replied to that saying the same thing about her, but replacing racist with paedophile. So they sued him, and then he countersued them. They sued him for the claim of paedophilia, he sued them for the claim of racism, and remarkably the judge decided that calling them a paedophile was a defamation of character, even though it was clear that he was saying you're clearly not a paedophile was the intention. But the judge also decided that calling someone a racist wasn't defamatory. So calling someone a paedophile is defamatory according to this judge, but there was no evidence that calling him a racist was damaging to his reputation, although we know full well that in today's climate, perhaps the worst thing, well, paedophilia and racism are the two worst things you can accuse anybody of. Both of those terms are guaranteed to destroy your reputation and your career and lose you future earnings. Laurence Fox claims that it's been impossible for him to find work after this. And, he claims to have been earning about £500,000 a year, so a clear loss there. And this is so shocking because, in one sense, for a couple of reasons, but it actually sort of suggests that if you call Tony Blair or Alistair Campbell a murderer for the Iraq War, that suddenly now they can sue you. Even though it's obviously you're not saying that they're Jack the Ripper. And also disturbing is this idea that the judge couldn't bring it upon herself to actually define what racism is, and this idea that now anybody can be called a racist without any fear of repercussions on the person using that very dangerous epithet, which I think is deeply disturbing. In the American Constitution, there's a very good article by Brendan O'Neill on this subject. You can find in Spiked Online, and he points out in the American Constitution, you are allowed to use exaggeration and rhetoric to make your point. We have a rich language which enables you to use flourish to underline and underscore a point. It seems here a very retrograde decision that means you can only speak literally and only say clear basic facts without any type of expansion or literary flourishes. It's deeply disturbing on all those counts, I think.
But do you think, therefore, is it sort of kind of dumbing down, whereby we are now being so literal-minded, as you're suggesting, or is it downright political?
It's difficult to say, but what we are seeing is that the courts definitely aren't reflecting the culture, because, as Rafe said, currently in society, to be called a racist is possibly the worst thing you can be called. And people think it's quite acceptable for you to be ostracised, cancelled and never forgiven again for being a racist. And yet at the same time, our institutions are pushing an ideology which essentially says racism is everywhere, and we're all unconsciously racist, especially if you're white. And if you're white, the only thing you can do really is to admit your racism, and then somehow atone for your racism, in which case, if we all admit our racism, we should all be ostracised and all cancelled and nobody can speak to anybody. So there is this extreme contradiction within this notion of racism that doesn't make sense. And the courts don't seem to be taking into account any of these cultural changes. So we end up having a very literal definition of some words, and other words like racism, everybody's very confused because we have ideas of systemic racism and other forms of racism that don't seem to match up. So it's the courts, I speak to a lot of lawyers who are very confused by terms like systemic racism and how it's used in the law, and how other terms like racism are used, and how to prove it or disprove it, when there is such a degree of a debate and discussion around what these terms mean, because nobody knows what it means anymore.
Yes. Does it actually mean that sort of it's open season, that just anyone can call Laurence a racist whenever they like? Is that what the...
Yes.
Well, yeah, well, on the basis of it, that's what it suggests. Now, Laurence Fox is now suing another person who's called him a racist in 4 tweets, a Muslim chap. And
Today?
I think he's doing that, that's just been in the last couple of days, and I think the reason for that is he actually wants to test, without this counterclaim distraction getting in the way, actually get a clear ruling on whether or not he actually is a racist under these terms, which of course might support him in the other case if he wants to appeal that. I mean, the judge's reasoning was interesting. The judge thought that no reasonable person reading those tweets would understand the nuance of Laurence Fox's argument. That any reasonable person would assume he was calling them a paedophile. But I'm sorry, that's underplaying the intelligence of the average British person to a huge degree, to think they're not capable of. It's not a very nuanced argument. It's quite a basic 2-step argument. And yes, and I have to actually also wonder, and I've got no evidence for this. It's quite controversial to say, but this was a female judge. And I wonder whether a male judge would have made a similar verdict here, because of course we know that women on the whole are much more likely to be buying into progressive ideology and to have bought into that. And I can't read this verdict in any other way than to think that this person, even though they're supposed to be impartial, does have leanings towards progressive ideology.
Well, that's how it sort of feels. I mean, would you go along with that?
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. I mean, they've both got equal defamation claims, and one has won and one has lost, and one has said that it's not acceptable to call someone a paedophile, but it is acceptable to call someone a racist. And that judgment must come down to the 2 parties and what the values that you hold, because it's not clear as to why one would be seen as worse than the other.
All I can imagine is that the judge thinks Laurence Fox is racist, and thinks that the tweets that Laurence Fox has made over the past few months suggest that he strongly is racist. So there's a judgment there, but she's not come out and said that. Instead of that, she's refused to give a definition, which I think is actually even worse in a way.
There's also something that actually Laurence himself pointed out on Twitter, which is part of this problem, is that then one of the, what would have been defendants or co-defendants, the woman, a drag queen, then said, oh, and do you know he actually used the N-word, for example, when he was talking in court. Again, this was taking something entirely literally. He was quoting a rap song, but it's sort of almost enough now just to say something. We see this, don't we, even when we talk about films and drama and whatever. It's enough to say something, that's all. What do you think the general implications are for free speech, that battered concept? What do you think of free speech?
Well, I just think it's very chilling. I think people used to believe that logic and justice would ultimately prevail if you were ever slurred or slandered or libelled. And unfortunately, after this sort of ruling, I don't think the average person can actually feel that comfortable. And that, I think, is ultimately that's the biggest disaster and danger here, is it further erodes the public's trust in the justice system.
Yes.
And when we have trust in our police at an all-time low, all of our institutions have been eroded. You know, the judiciary's had its, you know, controversies in recent years, but it was still seen, compared to, say, the elected American judiciary, which is clearly biased, and it's quite pathetic to see these battles on the Supreme Court. We've always hoped that we had sort of one of the finest judiciaries in the world. But when you see these sorts of things coming out, then you can't help but wonder whether there's any institution upon which we can really rely for an honest judgment.
Yes, I sort of automatically assume now that they are pretty much politically biased. You know, it always used to be, people used to think they were reactionary, you know, and totally out of touch.
Yes, yeah.
But in fact now I sort of think, well, the people who are now High Court judges and Court of Appeal judges, they would have been students around about the late 60s. They would have been mired in all the kind of institutional left-wingery, wouldn't they?
Yeah, and as you say, with regards to like the use of the N-word, so much of these arguments are done in bad faith, intentionally.
They know, don't they?
They know what's going on, but it's just weaponised. And in the case of free speech, I mean, the issue that we're having is that there is no longer an agreed upon understanding of what words mean. So how can we even have an argument? I mean, that's the issue.
It's obviously yet another one of those signposts along the way, isn't it? And what is Laurence? What's his step? He's actually going to be coming on the channel to talk about all this, but he's going to appeal again.
I think he's looking to appeal
to the Supreme Court.
If they'll take it on. We'll see.
Yeah. I wanted to turn now to this very worrying. Well, it's not a new development, actually, is it? But we've had the resignation, or should I say, the intention to resign of the MP Mike Freer, who is MP for Finchley and Golders Green, London. Right. And this happened yesterday, actually, didn't it? This is because he has had, 10 years of intimidation, which has reached a pitch recently, isn't it?
Yeah, I think the final straw was an arson attack on his office last year, the end of last year. It's yet to be determined the motivation, but it is within the context of, as you say, a string of threats upon not just his life, but on his family's life. He's had extremists, Muslim extremists, Islamist extremists threaten to stab him, telling him he's not welcome in Muslim areas. The actual Islamist terrorist that went on to murder Sir David Amis actually threatened Mike Freer with that he was going to come to his constituency and harm him.
3 or 4 years ago,
yes,
wasn't it?
Yeah. So I guess that highlights that these threats are very real. I mean, for him to be threatened like that, and then to go on to see one of his colleagues be killed. He has spoken about how he lives in fear of his life. He almost has to check CCT everywhere. And he has decided that he can no longer continue in British politics as a result. And what this shows really is that political violence, or terrorism, I guess what you would say, is being used to deter MPs from continuing in their careers, deter them from speaking about certain issues. He is the MP for a majority Jewish area, one of the biggest,
Jewish,
one of the most Jewish areas in London, and obviously he's spoken about some of the anti-Semitism that his constituents face, and for that he has felt like there's threats upon his life. So what we're really seeing here is the way in which, as I said, political violence is being used to undermine democracy. In a sense, we no longer have a democracy, we have a mafia. We have a sense where we have a situation where power is being obtained through threats and intimidation rather than through free debate, discussion, democratic voting. Actually, it's just sheer power through force, actually.
This is, it's quite unbelievable. There seems to be zero moral or physical protection for him.
Well, let's be quite clear. This is the politics of places like Pakistan being imported, right? Yeah. Intimidation, arson, death threats, mobs coming to your offices and hanging, as we've seen outside. Even Labour MPs have these mobs outside their offices, and these sorts of activities going on. And let's be clear here, some people might say, oh, well, this chap was going to lose the next election anyway. No, Mike Freer was one of the few MPs who was on the list of people who were most likely to win their seat at the next election, because no one in Golders Green is going to be voting for the Labour Party, right? So this was actually one of the Tories' safest seats. So he's deliberately turning away a future career in politics for this, rather than just deserting the ship. And it does sort of, erode all of our faith in politics when we see the politics of fear and aggression becoming more strong in this country. And remember, we're discussing this also a day after we had an acid attack in South London. We still have a teacher in Batley in hiding. Now we've got death threats forcing politicians out of office. This is the scary reality of life in modern Britain. I mean, we've also had for years now corruption running amok in Tower Hamlets, with its strong Bangladeshi community, again bringing the politics of Asia into London, and we're just seeing the more extreme elements of it coming out now. And no one is taking a stand against any of this. People are letting it run amok. And it's also nepotism. I mean, all of these anti-democratic practices are coming into the world's oldest continuous democracy, and I think it's shameful that no one is brave enough to actually call this out for what it is and take active steps to try to prevent it.
Well, yes. I mean, isn't this another one of those turning points? It wasn't a turning point in the end. I mean,
this chap is backing off in Mayor Lufter Rahman, for example. This notoriously corrupt chap. He's now mayor again of Tower Hamlets or Newham, wherever it is.
But what would it take actually for people actually to stand up? I mean, what actually you've got to tell me, because I just simply don't know. What has the Prime Minister said anything about this? This is one of his backbenchers, isn't it? I mean.
It may be too soon. I don't know. I haven't heard anything.
But I mean, it's worth saying at the time of this recording, Sadiq Khan has yet to comment on it. Other MPs have come out and said things, but we rarely see Sadiq Khan speaking about these issues. It just kind of.
Whereas you know full well, had this been because of neo-Nazi white supremacists, this would be wall-to-wall news, and it will be the number one topic on the news at 1 and the news at 6, you guarantee. And Sadiq Khan would have his own special video dedicated to it, I imagine.
But this is the point, isn't it? That the whole point among all those cases that you just listed as well is that a denial of the truth, because the fact is that there is an ideology in place which simply cannot be seen to fail, which is that of multiculturalism and the wonderfulness of mass migration.
Well, it just reminds you of Naz Shah, the MP's tweet about the grooming, the rape gangs, saying just shut up about it. This is the same type of thing. For the sake of diversity, just shut up about it. And once again, let's ignore all the blatantly obvious evidence we have around us in order to achieve this
I think this is really another example in the fact that multiculturalism doesn't work when you have an idea that there can be a plurality of cultures that all tolerate each other, but an aspect of one of those cultures does not believe in tolerance. It doesn't believe in British values of non-violence or debate or discussion, and it just applies a notion of brute force. Then you can't have multiculturalism, and democracy is just undermined. And we're seeing lots of examples of that, like with Catherine Birbalsingh in the Kayla school. She's bent over backwards to try to make a school that is multicultural and for it to work. She's tried to get everybody singing the national anthem, everybody to eat the same, everybody to be treated completely equally, and she's still ended up having a lawsuit against her, even though it's a secular school. The lawsuit is regarding a Muslim child that wants to pray. So it's, we are seeing people really trying to make multiculturalism work, and it isn't.
The thing is, you see, with the Catherine, because it is exactly one of a piece with this, really, in a way. With the Catherine Birbalsingh thing, the only thing one can accuse her of maybe is naivety, I would say. All that what you said there, I think, is absolutely true. She's sort of sincerely trying, but then there are many of us who say, I'm afraid it's just not going to work.
But there's a broader issue here going beyond the issue of Islam and multiculturalism, and that's the sort of society that we now live in, one which is extremely radicalized on all sides. So, for example, if you look at MPs who have been assassinated in Britain, before the 20th century, all of them, bar one, had been killed by Irish Republicans as an organised attempt to kill people, apart from Spencer Perceval, 1812, that was a lunatic. But since the 21st century, all of them have been these sort of lone wolf, radicalised idiots, not just Islamic, but also what white people have done this as well, including the stabbings. You know, there was Nigel Jones with a sword was attacked and his aide was murdered. So that's what's interesting. Since the 21st century started, all of the attacks on MPs have been done by people who've been radicalised in some way. And whether it's social media playing a part in that, or whether it's just disaffection with politics and the MP's expenses scandal, there's been a very, very dramatic shift in people's attitudes towards MPs, where all MPs now have become figures of hate, no matter what their actual record may be. People don't seem to know that. As soon as they have the letters MP after their name, they become fair game. And I think that's very damaging for democracy, because of course it's going to put off generally decent and talented characters.
Yes. Do you remember actually when Sir David Amis was killed, that the response of Parliament was actually to debate the dangers of social media?
Yeah.
I mean, talk about displacement activity.
Unlike when Joe Cox was murdered,
Yes.
and then it was an attack on the right wing.
Well, it was not just an attack; it was an attack on anyone wanting to vote for Brexit.
Yes, yeah.
And I did think it was quite brave of Mike Freer to actually, in his statement, to name particular Muslim groups that have targeted him, and to really name the issue, rather than glossing over it, because you don't often see that. But he was saying, it's a specific group that have targeted me.
Although, I read newspaper reports, I think it was either the Times or Telegraph, and if you read this report, you were none the wiser, actually, as to the identity. I mean, it's not unlike, it sounds like one's making a spurious connection, but with this Clapham acid attack, we don't know. The police are asking for people for information, and they won't give a description of it.
I heard a few years ago on Radio 4 there was some murder, and they said the suspect is wearing a red cap and a black hoodie, whereas the key identifier, the actual colour of the person, was completely omitted. I thought that might be actually quite helpful information to have. But you're quite right. This morning I listened to Radio 4 with Nick Robinson discussing this Mike Freer story. Not once was Islam ever meant, Muslim and Islam never passed the lips of the BBC in what is actually the crux of that entire story.
So in fact, really, it's anti-Semitism. So what does that mean? That we've all become suddenly more anti-Semitic? I mean, no, come on, it's not, is it?
No, it's almost an insult to the memory of Sir David Amis and people that are, targeted because they're not given proper justice, or that what's happened to them isn't properly acknowledged in terms of what caused the death or the insult or the injury. It's not fair that. I mean, Mike Freer has been very clear about what the issue is, and yet the media are pushing back against that.
The media, you say, who knew, for goodness sake? But frankly, it is actually the media that is our great enemy in this sense, isn't it? In the mainstream media, in that they just cover for everything, don't they? They absolutely do.
Even with regards to the people that perpetrated the arson attack on Mike Freer's office, that's being kind of hush. We don't know much about that. Happened on Christmas Eve. I don't know if that's significant, but it's all downplayed, and the problem will just inevitably get bigger, because people will be emboldened. The people committing these crimes will be emboldened. They'll think, we can get away with it.
Do you sense, actually, on the basis of the cases we've just all talked about, do you sense that people are, I say wising up about this, but this is rising as an issue again very much? Because when it was like the problem with Islamic fundamentalism around the time that straight after 9/11, and then we had the 7/7 here, terrible Madrid attacks, and these were terrorist attacks. But then when we had it in Manchester, of course, it was all don't look back in anger. Well, frankly, I don't know what will make you angry enough. Your daughters were being slaughtered, in Manchester. That didn't seem to make people. I wonder what it would take. I get the feeling that the people are feeling more and more restless about this, or is it just me? Do you think so, or not really? Honest.
I think people have become resigned now more than ever to the reality that nothing's going to happen with all of this. Because as you said, when you've bombed stadiums, when you've bombed the tube and buses, when you've beheaded people in the streets of London, I mean, what other level of things have to happen for people to take notice? They haven't taken notice. You've got Teacher in Hiding, you've got cinemas pulling films out of the cinema. I mean, you've got, you know, groups picketing outside schools and so forth. You've got, you know, as I said, you've got rape gangs going unnoticed. I mean, all of this just convinces people that the authorities and the elite are not on our side, and that, as you were saying earlier, everything is being hushed up for the sake of diversity. And unfortunately, I can't see I can't see what it would take to make things change.
No, it's I don't know whether you saw today, but there was an article in the Telegraph by Alistair Heath. I don't know why I've immediately gone to that, but I have. Which is basically saying that Europe might as well just shut up shop because it's basically in terminal decline. Now, he goes into all sorts of different areas, but this is sort of one of them. Demographic, just complete demographic decline, but also a total unwillingness to confront these sorts of issues. And it's very, very hard reading through this to actually, you know, disagree. But then, of course, what is one therefore saying? I mean, basically, what are we going to do? Go into a room and just simply put our heads in a gas oven? Of course not. You know, I mean,
we
have
are
to
a few
fight.
steps away from Europe in that regard still, so we're still a bit more democracy loving and a bit more alert to the stuff than they are on the continent of Europe, where the Germans and others are really have their heads in the sand. And of course, Alistair Heath's argument isn't really about Europe, it's about Western Europe, because you still have in Central and Eastern Europe strong identification with faith and flag and country, and a strong aversion to demographic change and so forth, which I think needs to be. And it's important to note also, I mean, we may be witnessing the decline of Western Europe, but we may also be seeing the rise of Central and Eastern Europe. As I've said before, you know, Poland's going to have a GDP larger than the UK by 2030. You know, 50 or 100 years from now, that may prove to be the burden, the great sort of beacon of light of Europe.
But even so, even with Alistair Heath being so frank today, particularly for someone who wouldn't really have highlighted those things at one point, he sort of does this sort of thing where he says, well, the problem was, he said, is this huge demographic change brought about by, you know, untrammeled migration is inevitably going to lead to really nasty people coming to the fore. So the problem is actually the response.
Meaning that the right wing are going to come to power.
Yes.
The problem is the response, not the actual problem. The changes in our culture as a result. You know?
Yes, I mean, hopefully the thing that will wake people up is the increase in anti-Semitism, which, you know, it's difficult to, you know, argue about. I mean, you know, Mike Freer's constituency, as I've said, is mainly Jewish. And what a state of affairs where the majority Jewish constituency, the MP for that area has to step down for speaking out about anti-Semitism. What must that make his constituents feel like? You know,
Yes.
that the one MP speaking up for them can't continue for fear of his life. I mean, it's
And who's going to be brave
awful.
enough to replace him?
Yes, exactly. It's a good point.
The thing is, Amy, with what you're doing as the SDP candidate for London, I mean, you know, like you don't know, but you've got your work cut out, haven't you? I mean, you know, because a lot of the things we talked about are London-based.
Yes,
you know, Mike Freer is London-based,
Yeah.
Clapham, these are all areas of London, you know, but it's around the country too. How does one actually go about putting a platform up, you know, which goes against an absolute, well, I'm asking like I don't know, but I mean, you know, an absolute ingrained ideology that, you know, books no opposition, which is that diversity is our greatest strength, and that if you actually don't go along this, says that you're wicked. I mean, you know,
I mean, you almost have to completely ignore party politics and the idea of tactical voting, because if you're aiming to get votes, you would be completely silent on all of these issues.
Yeah.
But then how does that help? You know, you have to give a voice to these issues, even if that, you know, affects your popularity. But there are people for whom even just seeing somebody speaking out about these issues can make a huge difference, and it can encourage people to do the same. So yeah, it can feel a bit futile at times, but I think if nobody else does, then, you know,
that's the ultimate thing.
Yeah.
You got to do that.
Yes,
you know, I mean, you say it's futile. It's not futile, not at all. It's the least futile thing in a way. So on a Well, no, actually, it's not a brighter note. It kind of just looks brighter. But you might have seen this video, actually, on social media this week. But before we talk about it, I just want you to just take a look. It was on Twitter. Here it is.
Religion you're allowed to do anywhere.
No, miss, you're not allowed to sing church songs outside of church grounds, by the way.
You're not allowed to sing church songs outside
of church songs or church
you're not allowed
grounds. That's fine. That's
you're
fine.
not allowed. She just said you're not allowed to sing church songs outside of church.
Outside of church grounds, unless you have
That's
you've
a load
been
of rubbish.
authorized by the church to do this kind of song.
It's not saying anything anymore.
Are you saying that you don't care about the Human Rights Act? You're lost?
Now, look, this was, I love this thing. I don't know if you saw church songs. I think she means hymns, doesn't she? She means hymns. Yeah. But this is a perfect example. This girl was on, it's Oxford Street, isn't it, I think?
Yeah.
And she was just playing, just hymns or whatever.
Christian songs, yes. And yeah, she's a gospel singer. She was playing songs. Lots of buskers are on Oxford Street singing songs, perfectly normal. And a volunteer policewoman who you wouldn't know she was a volunteer for. I couldn't tell she was a volunteer from the way she was dressed.
What, a plastic policeman they call
Yeah,
it,
well, she would pass as a police officer. Came up because
yeah.
From what she was looking, you wouldn't know, and she didn't introduce herself as far as I can see as a volunteer. Came up to this singer and said, "You're not allowed to sing church songs out of church," which is completely made up.
Yes.
Just entirely made it up off the top of her head. And actually, what you saw from the footage is that this volunteer knew more about the law than this volunteer did. She actually said, well, no, according to Section 9 of the Human Rights Act and religious freedoms, I am allowed to sing. Yeah. To which the volunteer policewoman stuck her tongue out. So presumably this was all just a game or a bit of fun. But of course, you get the sense with this that, lots of issues come up with this, but I think there's an idea that mocking Christians or telling or clamping down on Christians is fair game, and it's just a bit of fun. You don't really see this happening to other forms of religious expression. In the last several months, we've seen whole groups of Muslims coming together with a call for prayer and shouting jihad, and I think police officers, whether they're volunteer or otherwise, would be far too scared to intervene and say anything. But when it comes to Christians, it's all a bit, we can just have a laugh, we can just, persecute them, and it doesn't really matter.
You see, sticking your tongue out like that, I'd just sort of dismiss her immediately, wouldn't you?
Yeah, well, it just shows how amateurish and sort of immature this woman is, Look, she's a volunteer policewoman. We must always support volunteerism. The voluntary ethic is something that distinguishes us in general. But what happens, of course, is you get bad apples who are on a power trip. And clearly this is somebody who's, she works at Costa Coffee, and, clearly she was enjoying this role for the ability to actually just mete out her on-the-spot justice as she sees it. The bizarre thing, of course, is that, Jesus wanted Christians to go out and preach the gospel. That's kind of the message of Christianity. So the idea you can only do these sorts of things within church walls is for the birds. But, when people ask me what my idea of hell is, I always say it's walking down Oxford Street on a Saturday afternoon. I can't think of anything more hellish in the world. You've got Roma gypsies begging on the streets, you've got pickpockets, you've got shady characters, you've got all the flotsam and jetsam of life on the street, you've got these candy shops, money laundering. There are so many targets the police could be looking at and should be looking at, and instead they're picking on a harmless person singing gospel songs. Never mind that, as Amy was saying, the Islamic preachers who used loudspeakers, and we've even had calls to prayer on the streets of Oxford Street. All of that goes by the by, and yet these are the easy pickings, the low-hanging fruit are to go for the Christians as usual.
And also, actually, this week we had a call to prayer. No, not a call to prayer. Yes, a call to prayer, actually, at the beginning of Redbridge Council. I don't know if you saw this.
No.
And basically all the councillors had to stand up and be quiet while, I assume it was a call to prayer, was it? Into the microphone. But it's just, two-tiered policing, two-tiered everything, frankly.
Yeah.
But I thought that was a particularly embarrassing one with that woman.
But it's also the creeping authoritarianism, right?
Yes.
It's just the most recent example of the police overstepping the mark and telling people to do things that simply aren't true.
Yeah.
And again, it shows the level of ignorance amongst the police, the youngest police force we've ever had. But it also is quite dangerous in terms of the loss of civil liberties we're seeing eroded year on year.
It's also a concern about the lack of seriousness in which the role of being a police officer is taken, that somebody can so easily become a volunteer and represent the police, and yet totally disrespect the public. I mean, the role of the police officer is to uphold the law. It's an extremely significant role, and to maintain the relationship between the citizen and the state. And if somebody can so easily become a volunteer and represent themselves as the police, it's a crime to impersonate a police officer for a reason. And yet you could just do a few training days and wear the uniforms. It seems if you wanted to impersonate a police officer, you could do that quite quickly and get away with it.
That was a particularly bad impersonation of that part, wasn't it? Yeah.
I think Rod Stewart's wife is also a volunteer police officer.
Who is?
Rod Stewart's wife.
Oh, yes.
She's supposed to be very good, actually.
Yes. Well, she's tall. She's absurdly tall.
Yes.
I mean, that must make a difference, surely. Thank you very much, Amy. All the very best with this camp. Well, you can tell us about it as it goes along. Thank you very much, Ray. And that's it for this week. Do remember Tuesday, the 6th of February in Wellingborough. Do get in touch if you want to come. But we shall see you next week. Thank you. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.